Hey there, my name's Brashler, and in this video, I want to do a shootout between the Midas DP48, the Behringer P24, the Behringer P16-M, and the Behringer P16-HQ. Now, if you're brand new to my channel, I'm all about helping you feel more confident with your production gear, no matter where you're starting from. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, if you've been around the X32 for a while, you have recognized this unit. It is the P16-M. And you've also probably recognized this unit. This is the Midas DP48. And there's quite a bit of difference between the P16-M and the DP48. I mean, the DP48 gives us 48 channels of adjustability over 12 groups, and you can actually mix two sets of in-ears from one unit. So you have the A side and you also have the B side. There's also ambient mics built in, and there's a whole bunch of really cool features of the DP48 that I have some videos dedicated to the DP48 system. But then we have the P16-M, and this thing is classic. It's 16 channels, and you, of course, can mix all 16 independently. You can group channels together to make a stereo pair, everything like that. And this is sent over Ultranet, whereas the DP48 is sent over AES-50. Now, when the Behringer WING was released, we had this new thing called the P24. And the P24 gives us up to 24 channels of adjustability. We also have an aux mic and talkback and foot switches and everything like that. And you can also group up channels so that you could actually have 12 stereo channels, or 24 mono channels. And then we also have the P16-HQ. Now, the HQ is a replacement to the P16-M. You can no longer purchase the P16-M brand new, but there are some very cool things about the HQ that are much better than the P16-M. So if you are trying to purchase some P16 monitor systems, you will most likely find the P16-HQ. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that you can use both of these in the same system at the same time. So you can actually route your Ultranet into the first P16-M and route it out into the P16-HQ and run those side by side. You can also use both of these with the P16D, which is a distribution system for these. So this is a direct replacement of the P16-M. So if you need to replace an older unit of the P16-M, you should look at the P16-HQ. Now, what I did is I went in with Smaart and I calculated a whole bunch of things. So a few things to note. I am not a certified testing lab. So all of the measurements that I took were with Smaart Rational Acoustics version 9, so Smaart Suite, and it was using my Behringer WING as the audio interface, and my measurements were sent from my computer over USB into the WING, and then I distributed it out to the various systems depending on their connectivity. So for instance, the DP48, I sent it directly off the AES-50. The P24 system, I sent it over Stage Connect. And then the P16-HQ and the P16-M, I sent over AES-50 to an SD8, and then out the Ultranet port to these units. Now, with that being said, I cannot accurately, completely to the T with very, very good results actually calculate distortion in the way that THD plus N is calculated in the grand scheme of things. I am also not able to correctly calculate noise floor or correctly calculate dynamic range. But my measurements are good enough for this video to give you a very accurate representation of the differences between these units. And the measurements that I have taken, I do stand behind. So I am not butchering any of these results. All of them were taken in a professional way. Okay. Disclaimer, done. So what I did find out is that in my testing, I found that the P16-HQ and the P24 were almost identical in all tests. THD, which is distortion, noise floor, max output, everything like that. Everything between the P16-HQ and the P24 was identical, which is very exciting. Now, one thing that was interesting is I was actually able to get 2 dB louder of an output clean without distortion being added a lot out of the P16-M versus the P16-HQ and the P24. So I was able to get about 2 dB louder of an output on the headphone out. Now then the other thing that I want to mention is the DP48. To get it clean, I had to actually reduce the output. I wasn't able to turn it up all the way to have a perfectly clean output with a 1K tone. And so the DP48 actually screwed it down a little bit lower, and I was only able to get about 12 dB less than the P16-HQ and the P24 out of the DP48. Now, what's interesting is the THD, or the distortion, was actually cleaner on the DP48 than any of these units at that lower volume. But once I turned it up to the point where I could get it to the same range as these 3 units, then the THD increased quite a lot. And I don't know if that's because there's extra circuitry or because we're trying to be mixing different things with 48 channels together. I actually don't understand why the THD is a little bit different with that, but it's just something to note. Now, with these levels that I was producing, it was very, very loud. I was not wearing my in-ears, but I did have a set of headphones connected to this whole test rig, and so I was able to replicate what headphones were in all of these situations. And so what was interesting is that at these volumes, you would definitely have some hearing damage after listening to the volumes that loud. So with all of this being said, most of you are not going to run the DP48 loud enough to the point where you are actually hearing the distortion. Same thing with these 2 units. You would have to be maxing out your channels and maxing out the send from your actual mixer. Okay, the other big thing that I found is that the P16-HQ, and again, the P24 is identical to the P16-HQ, the noise floor was 3 times quieter than the P16-M. 3 times quieter. That's a lot. And it's actually very impressive. So what I have done today is I have set up a test rig to replicate what that background noise sounds like and compare side by side the P16-M and the P16-HQ. And the noise difference between these is a lot. You can hear it audibly. Now, my test rig is that I have a 1K tone being generated from my Behringer WING, and that is being sent into a bus, which I have control over right here. And that bus then feeds over AES50 to a stage box, and then using the powered Ultranet to these 2 units, I'm then taking the line output out of these units, which I did measure the difference between self-noise on the headphone out and the line out, and they were identical. So I am happy doing it in this way. And then that is going into 2 separate inputs into my Behringer WING, and then I am boosting the crap out of it. Okay, so if I go and select my P16-M and I go to my channel gain, I am maxing out my channel gain at plus 45 dB, and I am also adding 8 dB of trim. So if you have really good in-ears and really good hearing, you can hear the background noise of these 2 units. There's self-noise in every piece of gear. And it's not a knock about the gear, but what I'm wanting to show you is that the P16-HQ is so much better and so much improved over the P16-M. Okay, so with that being said, I have gain matched both of these. So what I'm going to do is I am going to turn this down so I don't wreck your hearing at home. And I am going to boost this up. And what we'll notice is that our gains here are pretty identical. So as I gain this up, we'll notice that both of those are at -6, and they are pretty much dialed in as close as I can get them as far as headphone output goes. So the headphone out on the HQ is identical to the M. Now, I know that there is also some background noise of my Behringer WING. When we boost a preamp all the way full gain and add digital trim, we are bound to get a little bit of background noise. And so I have an empty input on my input 3. So input 1 is the P16-M, input 2 is the P16-HQ, and input 3 is the empty input. So first thing that I'm going to do is unmute the empty input. This is the background noise of a fully gained out and trimmed input. You can barely hear it. It's there. I mean, if I boost this all the way up and I boost this all the way up, now we can hear it, okay? And so that's another 20 dB of gain to be able to hear that. And so I'm going to go put this back to 0 so we get back to this. Okay, so that's the sound of just the preamp by itself. It's a pretty good level. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute the P16-M at this point. So again, this is with no tone currently going to the P16-M, but it is turned up pretty much all the way, and it's being routed back into my console and boosted up a lot. We can hear that. We can hear it. It almost sounds like a choo-choo train. Very interesting. And what's interesting is, when we go look at Smaart, this is pretty much what that sound of that self noise looks like, okay? And so the main difference that I want to show you, and I'll show it to you on Smaart before I put it on the actual console, is that this is the self noise of the P16-HQ. And so we can see that there is a very big difference. Now, again, these measurements were gain matched. So the output was set to the same output level. It was clean on the distortion portion. And then the measurements were taken for self noise. I just want to keep that in mind for you guys. And so at this point, I'm going to swap over to the P16-HQ. That's pretty quiet. That is very quiet. Now, there is a little bit of a ground hum that I'm hearing, and that is because of some of my setup here in the studio. I have power supplies everywhere. This is probably the noisiest RF and audio environment that there is. I mean, I have power supplies for my monitor, my computer, my cameras, my laptop, the Wing, everything. So it's bound to get a little bit of noise. Now, remember, I am boosting these inputs by 45 plus 18 dB of gain, which is a lot of gain. Now, if I unmute this P16 send and I turn this up a little bit, we will start hearing the tone. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this down, and so we can hear that a lot. And so as I do this, they are gain matched. Okay, and let's turn it back up. Here's a P16-HQ. There's a P16-M. Now, the other thing I want to mention is I was able to measure the actual magnitude response. So basically the headphone output and how linear it is from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. I was also able to measure the phase response, which is the timing of all of those frequencies correct? And the P16-HQ actually had a better phase response than the P16-M and the DP48. There was a little bit of phase, and I mean, this is like so finite, no one's really going to notice a difference in that. And then the P24 was identical to the P16-HQ. And so let me show you the actual outputs at full volume with the magnitude showing 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. So on Smaart here, I'll jump over to this. And so first thing I want to show you is the P24 is right here, is this pink line. And the green line is the P16-HQ. Now this is a magnitude response. So this is showing you how much of a change is there between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. Now if I get all of these at 0, like that, we'll notice that pretty much all of them are identical. But we'll notice the P24 and the HQ, the P16-HQ, have a little bit of a boost here at 20K, 0.8 dB. Now, if we look at the P16-M, all the way here at 20K, there is a negative 0.5 dB loss at 20K. Now, remember, this is 20K, so most people aren't going to hear 20K. Because it's so high. And if you've been around music, chances are you have, if you're watching this channel, your hearing might have some damage. And so the fact that you hearing 20K is going to be a little, you know, whatever. That's fine. So if you can hear 20K, that's amazing. But most people aren't going to notice a dB or so boost of the HQ and the P24 in comparison to the P16-M. But what's great is this is a very, very linear magnitude response. We can see this line right here, where my mouse is 3 dB up, and there's 3 dB down. And so with my P24 and P16-HQ, right here is -1 dB at 20 hertz, and then at 20 kilohertz, it's 0.8 dB. So that's roughly a 2 dB difference between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. That is flat, my friend. That is very flat. And then the other thing I want to show you is the phase. So here is the phase difference between these two units. And so we can see that if I hide my P16-M, here is my P16-HQ, and here is my P24, and they are pretty much identical. And then if we add in our P16-M, we can see that the phase just kind of dips just a little bit between 500 hertz and about 4K. And then there's just a little bit of a ripple here, which again, this is not something that you're going to be audibly able to just tell and differentiate between these two, but it's just interesting measuring these. So obviously, this is a pretty geeky video. Like, I love really diving in and seeing how all of this gear works, and also measuring it to see, you know, what kind of quality are we going to be getting out of all of these units. And if you want to dive in more, I have a blog post that's linked down in the description below to all of my findings with all of these different units. Now, if you have a Behringer WING, you can use all 4 of these units. You can use the Midas DP48, you can use the P16-M, you can use the P16-HQ, you can use the P24. If you have the X32, you can do similar things. So you can use the P16-M, the P16-HQ, the DP48 natively. You know, you can use the Ultranet output on the X32 to go right to these units. You can use the AES50 to feed this DP48. With the P24 system, because it is Stage Connect, you would need to use a P24 Hub to be able to get to these units with your X32. Now, but the great thing is, all of these have fantastic audio quality. It is very clean from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. The distortion is extremely low and very similar to some of the published specs from Behringer that I was able to find. Also, your noise floor is pretty low for all of these units. And then the P16-HQ and the P24, the noise floor is even better, which is impressive. And with the P16-HQ and P24, there is a brand new digital to audio converter in these units. And that is what is to thank for the lower noise floor, plus more signal to noise ratio, which is fantastic. So if you want to check out more about the details of all of these measurements, you can jump down in the description below and it will head over to my blog. But I hope this video was helpful for you today. If you do happen to have any questions or there's a piece of gear that you want me to test, put it in the comment section down below, as I'm always reading through those comments to find videos that are going to be helpful for you. If you haven't already, make sure to check out my website at drewbrashler.com, where I have that blog post, and I also have some presets and digital downloads for all of the Behringer products, like the Wing, the X32, the X-Air, everything like that. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day.